The Haunting of Hollow Ridge. Episode 14, The Shadows Return. The sun was just beginning to set as Nina and the others walked away from the hill. They had survived, conquered the house, and broken the curse, or so they believed. The wind was gentle, the air cool, and for the first time in days, they felt as though they could breathe without the weight of Hollow Ridge pressing down on them. Yet, despite the calm, something nagged at Nina's mind, a faint unease that lingered just beneath the surface. She had felt it since they escaped the cavern. Even now, walking through the forest path toward their town, she couldn't shake the sensation that they hadn't truly left it all behind. As they neared the edge of the woods, Jack turned toward Nina. "You think we're really free, right? I mean, the house is gone. We saw it collapse." Nina hesitated before answering. "Yes. But I keep thinking about that voice. The house said it needed us, not just our fear, but us. What if we broke the curse?" Daniel interrupted, his voice firm, though his eyes betrayed his uncertainty. "It's over. We're not going to let the house mess with our heads anymore." Grace chimed in, her tone is shaky but optimistic. "Maybe it's just the trauma. After everything we went through, it's going to take time to feel normal again." Nina nodded, but deep down, she wasn't convinced. There was something they were missing. The feeling gnawed at her, pulling at her thoughts like the shadows that had once clawed at their skin. They walked the rest of the way in silence, the town finally coming into view as the last light of day disappeared behind the horizon. The streetlights flickered on, casting a soft orange glow over the quiet houses. It looked like any normal night, but to them, it was surreal, like returning to a world they no longer fit into. "Home," Tom muttered, rubbing his eyes. "I can't believe it." They stopped at the main square, where the familiar sight of the town's clock tower loomed over them. It was comforting, in a way, to be back where everything seemed ordinary. But as Nina looked up at the clock, her breath caught in her throat. The clock was ticking backward. "Guys," Nina whispered, pointing at the clock face. They turned to see the clock's hands moving in reverse, slow and deliberate. The air grew colder, and the streetlights flickered, casting long, distorted shadows on the ground. "What the hell?" Tom muttered, stepping back. "Is that?" Before he could finish, a dark figure emerged from the shadow of the clock tower. It was tall and formless, its outline shifting and twisting as if it were made of pure darkness. It had no face, but its presence was unmistakable. It was the same force they had fought in Hollow Ridge, the malevolent entity that had consumed the house. "You thought you were free," the voice echoed through the square, cold and mocking. "But you are mine." The ground trembled beneath their feet, and the shadows stretched toward them like tendrils, coiling around their ankles. The terror they thought they had left behind surged back with full force. "We destroyed you," Nina shouted, backing away from the creeping darkness. "We broke the curse." "You destroyed the house," the entity replied, its voice growing louder, more menacing. "But the house was only a shell. I am much older, much deeper. I have always been with you." The group scattered, instinctively running in different directions, but the darkness was relentless. It chased them, moving faster than they could, swallowing the light from the street lamps as it grew. Nina sprinted down a side street, her heart racing, her breath shallow. She glanced back to see the others also running, the entity's shadow stretching further and further, closing the gap. They couldn't outrun it. "To the church!" Daniel yelled, motioning toward the old stone building at the end of the street. It was one of the few places in town that had been there long before Hollow Ridge had been built. With no other option, they veered toward the church, the ancient stone walls towering before them like a sanctuary. As they reached the steps, the doors flung open, and they rushed inside, slamming the heavy wooden doors shut behind them. For a moment, the silence inside the church was deafening. The oppressive darkness outside pressed against the windows, but it didn't enter. The light from the candles around the altar flickered, casting faint, dancing shadows on the walls. Grace collapsed onto one of the pews, shaking. "What the hell is happening? Why is this thing still after us?" It wasn't just the house, Nina said, her voice trembling with realization. It's something older, something tied to this place. Hollow Ridge was just a conduit. The entity was using it to draw us in, but now it's free. Jack leaned against the door, trying to catch his breath. So what now? We can't just hide in this church forever. It's out there waiting for us. Nina paced, her mind racing. There had to be something they missed, some clue they didn't see. We need to know more. If this thing is older than the house, there has to be a way to stop it. Daniel stood up from where he had slumped against the wall. There's an old historian in town. My grandfather used to talk about him. He knows everything about the history of this area, maybe he knows about the entity. Nina looked at him, hope flickering in her eyes. Then we need to find him. Fast. The next morning, the group ventured out cautiously, the streets eerily empty. The town felt abandoned, though they knew people were likely hiding in their homes, unaware of the darkness stalking just beyond their sight. They made their way to the outskirts of town, where Daniel's contact, Mr. Harker, lived in a small, cluttered house surrounded by old, gnarled trees. When they knocked on the door, a frail, elderly man answered, his piercing blue eyes scrutinizing them from behind thick glasses. I know why you're here, Mr. Harker said, his voice low and gravelly. The shadow has returned. Nina stepped forward. You know about it? Mr. Harker nodded grimly. It's been here for centuries, long before Hollow Ridge was ever built. The house was just a way for it to grow stronger, to trap more souls. But it's not the source. It never was. Then what is? Jack asked, his voice desperate. Mr. Harker turned and motioned for them to follow him inside. The small house was filled with dusty books and ancient relics, strange symbols etched into nearly every surface. He led them to an old map of the town and the surrounding area. At its center was a large, dark stain, the ink spreading outward like a blot of corruption. This town was built on cursed ground, Harker explained, pointing to the stain. There was an ancient ritual performed here long before any of us were alive. The entity was born from that darkness, and it's been feeding on the souls of this town ever since. Hollow Ridge was just the latest manifestation. Nina stared at the map. So how do we stop it? Mr. Harker's face darkened. You have to return to where it all began. There's a place, a forgotten altar deep in the woods. That's where the original ritual was performed. You must go there and break the seal. But be warned, he added, his voice lowering to a whisper, the entity will not let you go easily. It will fight you every step of the way. Nina looked at the others, their faces pale but determined. There was no turning back now. Show us the way, she said. As they left Mr. Harker's house, the shadows began to stir again. The entity was watching, waiting. The final confrontation was coming. End of episode 14.